Hello and welcome to Topic 11, Lecture 1, and this topic deals with sentencing and punishment. So this semester we have two more topics left, and we are doing Topic 11 this week, Topic 12 next week. And Topic 11 serves as a really good segue between what we just were looking at with both the court structure and the court personnel, and then basically what happens in pretrial and trial procedures. And so topic 11 serves as a nice segue between courts and what we're going to be doing next week, which is looking at corrections. And so topic 11 deals with sentencing, and sentencing takes place in the courts, the sentencing itself. It's the judge who ultimately determines what the sentence will be, and it's based on both the recommendations of the prosecutor and the defense attorney. So again, we have the courtroom work group, and that the recommendations for sentencing that the prosecutor and the defense attorney make are a reflection of the sentencing guidelines that are established by the state. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. So recommendations are made to the judge, and the judge will deliver a sentence, will impose a sentence based on those recommendations and based on the sentencing guidelines. Now, as you'll read in your textbook, there are some mandatory sentences, so it really reduces the discretion of the judge if you say that there's a mandatory sentence that must be served. But for the most part, judges have a lot of discretion in terms of the sentence that they impose. In our next lecture, we're going to be talking about the death penalty. And the jury usually doesn't play a role in determining what the sentence is. But the jury, that's true except for in one major way. And that way is the imposition of the death penalty. And so when it comes to the death penalty and sentencing, it's a bifurcated process. In other words, that there is a trial to determine whether or not somebody is guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, a capital offense. And then if that person is found guilty, then there will be sort of a second trial or a phase of that trial, which is the jury determines whether or not the punishment for that crime should be the death penalty or not the death penalty. And so the jury does play a role, and we're going to be talking in the next lecture about why that is, why the jury plays a role. It has to do with making sure that the death penalty is imposed in a fair and equitable way according to the principles of due process. But for the most part, the jury does not play a role in sentencing. I say this as a segue to our next and final topic of the semester, because while the sentence is imposed in the court, the sentence or the punishment, right, is carried out by the correctional agencies, by the Department of Corrections and the people who work in the Department of Corrections. And so sometimes a sentence, as you'll read in the chapter, you could be sentenced to probation, or you could be sentenced to some sort of community corrections or a diversion. In other words, that a sentence will be imposed, like a year in jail. But if you do these things like drug treatment, get a job training, then you will not. You will be diverted away from that ultimate sentence. If you fail to do those things, then you would have to serve that sentence. And so the correctional agencies are involved in community corrections and probations, and to a certain degree in some of the rehabilitation programs. And then so you have correctional institutions, jails and prisons, and that's where if you are sentenced to a term of incarceration, or confinement, you would be that sentence would take place in a jail or a prison. And correctional agents, as we'll talk about in a little bit, can impact the length of your sentence, particularly if you are sentenced to an indeterminate sentence, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the goals of punishment, we're going to talk about sentencing models, and then we're going to talk about factors that impact sentencing. So let's get started. So, as we all know, Derek Chauvin was found guilty on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter last week. And now we're all sort of thinking about what is the sentence that he will receive, and he will be sentenced sometime in June. And so, when it comes to the length of sentence that he could potentially receive in terms of incarceration, that for the murder charges, he has no prior convictions. So for a murder charge, probably on the low range of 12 and a half years. For the manslaughter, 4 years. But in the upper range for the murder charge, that it could be as long as 40 years. And in fact, it could even be longer if the judge considers certain aggravating circumstances. So, in this section, we're going to be talking about the goals of punishment, that when we sentence somebody, what are we hoping to achieve? And so when you're thinking about Derek Chauvin and you're thinking about what punishment he deserves, these are some things that that we might be thinking about in terms of what's the purpose of the punishment. When we sentence Derek Chauvin, are we trying to set an example to other cops? We know that we have, a lot of excessive use of force within the police departments in the United States. And so should he receive a harsh sentence because we're seeking to send a message to other cops that might engage in the same behavior, make them think twice about doing this because Derek Chauvin gets a really long sentence? Are we wanting to make him suffer for the harm that he did to George Floyd and his family? Say that you think about the harm associated with the crime and that he should get a punishment that's on par with the harm that he caused the family and the community in general. Is he dangerous? Is this somebody that should be removed from society because he presents a danger to society? And so, these are things to sort of, as you're thinking about what sentence you think Derek Chauvin deserves, maybe think about some of these goals of sentencing that we're going to talk about next as it relates to the sentence you think that Chauvin should get. So there are 7 goals of punishment that your textbook talks about. We're going to go over these in sort of summary. And I'm obviously expecting you to read in more detail some of the pros and cons of each of these goals of punishment that the textbook talks about. The first goal they talk about of punishment is general deterrence. And general deterrence is that people should be punished in order to set an example for others, right? So when we were talking about Derek Chauvin and we were sort of like, he should get a really stiff sentence because we want to send a message to other cops that if you engage in excessive force, there's going to be in the death of an individual, that there's going to be a really big consequence for that action. And so remember in the crime control model, that one of the things we see in the crime control model is that that if you want to prevent crime, one way to do that is to send a message to those who are thinking about doing crime. Not that they've already committed crime, but thinking about doing crime. Because then they'll think twice about engaging in that act. And that's the goal of punishing somebody for a general deterrence. Now, keep in mind that when it comes to general deterrence, that it depends on the expectation that you're actually going to receive a punishment. In other words, do you expect that you're actually going to be caught and punished? Because as we know, many crimes are never reported to police. And so a lot of times people will just say, look, sure, I saw that Derek Chauvin got a really tough sentence, but that doesn't happen a lot to cops, right? I mean, cops generally engage in excessive behavior and they get away with it. And if you don't have somebody there taking a videotape, then chances are that you're going to get away with it. And so, if the reason you were punishing Derek Chauvin was for general deterrence purposes, that would depend a lot on other police officers thinking that there was an expectation that they would get caught and actually get punished. So you can sort of think about whether or not the effectiveness of general deterrence in terms of the reality that we live in terms of police and the excessive use of force, and oftentimes there not being a consequence for it. Another goal of punishment is incapacitation. Incapacitation is that you prevent crime by keeping offenders under state control. that people are so dangerous that they need to be taken out of society, right? And that they're doing so much disorder, so much harm that we're sentencing somebody to a term of incarceration because we want to get them out of society. We want to incapacitate them. Now, there's things to think about in terms. I mean, you can think for yourself about whether or not Derek Chauvin being on the streets is actually is he a danger to the community? You could sort of say, well, he doesn't have any previous convictions, so he hasn't been dangerous up to this point. But when you look at sort of the lack of remorse that he might have seen, and the fact that he had his knee on somebody's neck for so damn long and it didn't even really seem to like register to him that something horrible was happening, it seems like maybe there's a detachment there that might be indication that he doesn't really is sort of a dangerous person, because he doesn't, maybe he's like have some sociopathic sort of qualities. I'm not saying he does, I'm just saying that might be something to take into consideration. Now, just general incapacitation, that some things to think about in terms of a downside of incapacitation is that when you sentence a person to be incapacitated, to be incarcerated, that experience of incarceration can actually do more harm than good. And so maybe somebody engaged in a criminal act, but then being around other criminals for a long-term incarceration could actually make them more violent, right? And so the state controls a criticism of incapacitation is that state control could actually do more harm, and that the costs of incapacitation may exceed the benefits. One of the things they talked about in Locked In is that when you give somebody a long sentence for a crime that they committed in their 20s, that the cost of that long-term incarceration may well exceed any benefits, because a lot of times people age out of crime, okay? And so just some of the goals of incapacitation, but some of the complicating factors of it as well. Another goal of a punishment is specific deterrence. In other words, the personal experience of suffering or suffering punishment should inhibit future law violations. So I guess if you were thinking about Derek Chauvin, that you might want him to personally suffer so that he thinks twice about what he did, and that when he comes out of prison, he would never engage in that behavior again. The specific deterrence effects may be really limited for Derek Chauvin because he's never going to be a police officer again. But I guess for broader crimes, it could have some impact on him in terms of a goal. Now, your textbook talks about how that when it comes to specific deterrence, the evidence doesn't necessarily support that making a punishment really harsh actually deters a person from re-offense. They talk about how harsh punishment may bring about a sense of defiance with the convicted. 80% of inmates already have prior convictions. Nearly 70% will reoffend. And so, kind of calls into question whether or not punishment is actually having that effect. And they also talk about in your textbook about, you would think that like the harshest punishment would be super maximum prison. But studies show, as they talk about in your textbook, that people who serve in higher max, their sentence in higher max or super max prisons, penitentiaries, actually have a higher recidivism rate than those who do not. So again, the general goal of specific deterrence, but whether or not that actually is satisfied by the evidence of the impact of specific deterrence kind of calls that goal into question. Retribution is the idea that the criminal is punished simply because he deserves to be disciplined for what he did. Based on what the offender deserves. So if the punishment should be sort of proportionate. And so a lot of times people think that the death penalty is a punishment that is sort of a penalty. The goal of the death penalty is just desserts. You get what you deserve. You take an eye life, your life is going to be taken, an eye for an eye. And so it's kind of based on what the defender deserves. There's a sense that the offender is blameworthy, that they understand what they did and that they should take personal responsibility for what they did, that they are to blame for their crime. But as we know from our studies earlier this semester about when we read the article "The Brain on Trial," there's a problem with blameworthiness. That blameworthiness, linking punishment to the sense that a person should take personal responsibility for their crime and be punished accordingly, that really might not meet the greater goals of keeping our society safe. The last three goals are equity, restitution. And so that from this, the goal of punishing somebody is that part of their punishment might be restitution, that the criminal needs to pay back their victim for their loss, the criminal justice system and society for the cost associated with their crime. And so that could be built into a part of the punishment. The downside of that is what's the value of the victim or the family's loss? We probably know what the cost is to society and the justice system. We could probably figure that out. But I mean, if you're thinking about George Floyd and his family, I mean, what is the cost of the loss of George Floyd's life? Kind of hard to determine. Rehabilitation is the justice system. The goal of punishment, if the goal is rehabilitation, is that the justice system is obligated to help sick, unfortunate people, not simply punish them for their misdeeds, but actually rehabilitate them, help them get the treatment that they need to get better. So if they, maybe they committed the crime because they're drug addicts, or maybe they committed the crime because they are, that they have anger management issues, or maybe they committed the crime because they have a behavior disorder, or they're sociopathic. Well, the rehabilitation should be sort of related to, the sentence should be related to giving the offender a sense to get treatment and help that they need, so that they can actually come back into society and be a productive member of the society and no longer present that harm because they've been treated. When it comes to rehabilitation, I'm not sure how that would apply to the Derek Chauvin. But you could think about that in terms of a goal of punishment for him. But more broadly, are we really willing as a society to see offenders as treatable? Are they just evil people that can't be treated, right? So to what extent are we willing to extend a goal of rehabilitation to offenders who many might see as outside of the realm of being rehabilitated? Also, if you think that offenders should be rehabilitated, there's a cost associated with that because treatment programs cost money. Now, if you do a diversion, which is the next goal, which is basically sparing a non-dangerous offender from the stigma and labeling of a criminal conviction and further involvement with the justice process, because you are basically saying, we're going to sentence you, but if you do certain things, you won't have to serve that actual sentence, right? Then, maybe the cost of sending somebody to treatment and job training and getting them a job and anger management is actually less than the amount of money that we would pay on straight up incarceration. Okay. And so the rehabilitation, while it might cost money, from a diversion perspective, it could actually cost less money, because if the offender achieves their diversion goals, treatment, then we would save money because they wouldn't be incarcerated, and we would save the further cost, social costs associated with the stigma and labeling of being a convicted, not just convicted felon, but the cost associated with actually being incarcerated and the impact that can have on a person, but the impact that it has on the family and the society as well. Next, we're going to turn and take a look at sentencing models. These are pretty easy to understand, so we'll go over them relatively quickly. So in the United States, those convicted of crimes are sentenced by two main models. One is known as the indeterminate sentence model, and the other is the determinate sentence model. And to know what kind of sentences those are, it's important to know what the words indeterminate and determinate mean. Indeterminate means that it's undefined, not exactly known, right? So if you receive an indeterminate sentence, we're not exactly sure how much time explicitly that individual will spend behind bars. A determinate sentence is established, it's known, it's defined, that you are given a sentence of X number of years and you serve those sentences. We'll take a look at those and the pros and cons of each of these in one moment. The model that's used is determined by law, okay? So depending on what state you live in, it tells you whether or not the determinate sentencing model is used or an indeterminate sentencing model is used. The majority of states use an indeterminate sentencing model. Wisconsin does not. We have a determinate sentencing model known as truth in sentencing. So actually, let's go in and take a look in more detail at each of these models. So, an indeterminate sentence is that offenders are placed in confinement only until they are rehabilitated and then they're released on parole. Okay. So, this idea is with an indeterminate sentence, it couples really well with one of the goals of sentencing, which is rehabilitation. So an example of an indeterminate sentence is that you are sentenced to 5 to 10 years. Okay. The minimum number of years you're going to serve is 5. The maximum number of years you can serve is 10. But you could be released at 5 years. You could be released at 6.5 years. You could be released at 10 years. So the idea is that the closer you come to actually rehabilitating yourself, showing that you can join back into society and that you're no longer going to be a threat to social order, that's when you are released. Okay. So there are some real benefits to the indeterminate sentencing model. One of the benefits is it's an incentive for good behavior, and it's an incentive for taking it, availing yourself as somebody who is an inmate of rehabilitation services. And so, as you read in your textbook, you can earn good time credits. So the better your behavior is, the more days you can cut off your sentence. And also, if you take drug treatment or other rehabilitation programs, that can cut time off of your sentence as well. So it incentivizes good behavior. A downside of it is that the role that correctional agents and the parole board play in determining whether or not somebody serves 5 years or 10 years. That each state that has parole, that each state has certain features of who serves on their parole board. And in some cases they're judges, but in other states they're not. But you're basically putting the sentence in the hands of this correctional board, a parole board. And, so a downside of this is, should that sentence really be changed based on what the parole board thinks, particularly if there's not maybe a standard across the board of who's selected to serve on the parole board. And as studies have shown, that there can be a lack of clarity in terms of why parole is denied, and that can lead to a lot of frustration for the inmate, right? They feel like they've got good time. They go to the parole board. They feel like that they are, rehabilitating themselves, but the parole board disagrees. As I was going to say, some studies even indicate that if you want to get parole, see the parole board right after lunch or early in the morning, right after breakfast, because that the aggregate data shows that people who go to the parole board when the parole board is hungry, like right before lunch, you're more likely to be denied parole. Well, that's pretty effed up. Sorry for my language. But that is one of the downsides of sort of the discretionary aspect of parole boards. And that can result in bias as well. So unless there is a strict criteria that's followed, right, that there can be a potential for bias in terms of who gets released and who doesn't get released. The other sentencing model is determinant sentences. Determinant sentences are fixed. It's a fixed term of years to be served by the offender sentenced to prison for a particular crime. So the example is a person is sentenced to 15 years, a flat 15, and that's what you will serve. As I mentioned before, Wisconsin is starting in 2000. So if you committed your crime after January 31st, 1999, okay, then you would be subject to Wisconsin's truth in sentencing laws. And what that basically means is that at the time that you are sentenced, for one, felons are required to serve their entire length of their what's known as a bifurcated sentence. And so when you're sentenced, you're going to be sentenced to a term of incarceration, and then you're going to be sentenced to an extended supervision. For the most part, people in the state of Wisconsin, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, under truth in sentencing, felons serve the full time of both incarcerated and extended supervision. Okay, so it's pretty harsh. What are some of the reasons for the truth in sentencing, and what are some of the benefits and downsides of it? One reason is there's a sense of equal justice, right? That when you can have indeterminate sentences, an individual that commits, two individuals that commit the same crime, and they get a sentence of 5 to 10 years. one individual could serve 5 years, the other individual could serve 10 years, right? Even though they committed the same crime. So there's a lack of a sense of equal justice, right? And that's what kind of motivated a lot of the truth in sentencing laws. That the idea is that when somebody is sentenced, they actually serve their whole term, so that the community can kind of have confidence in that they actually are like about the way in which they are punished. So from a community and a victim perspective, the benefits of truth in sentencing is that both the victim and the community knows the length of the sentence. So if you are a victim of a crime and a person is sentenced to 15 years, you don't have to be worrying like if they had an indeterminate sentence, like, and it was 5 to 15, you'd be like, well, they're going to be released at 6, 7 years. And so the community as well. So there's a sense of confidence in the length of the sentence. The downside is it doesn't incentivize good behavior, right? And it doesn't incentivize really rehabilitation either. That when you're in for 15 years, well, why would you avail yourself to rehab programs, or why would you avail yourself to good behavior? There's no consequence. Maybe there is a consequence, because it could be added onto your sentence, but there's really no incentive for improving yourself, and that is an important goal. So one of the downsides of determinate sentences. Another downside is that people who are sentenced are incarcerated for a longer period of time. And so the cost that has to the individual, the family, and the community as well. So when it comes to sentencing models, which is the better sentence? If you were sentenced, would you prefer an indeterminate or determinate sentence? If you were a victim of a crime, which would you prefer for the offender? Would you rather them get an indeterminate or a determinate sentence? And also just ask yourself, and this is kind of prepping for some of the stuff that we'll do on the final exam, if the goal of sentencing is blank, which model more is able to achieve that goal? So if the goal of sentencing is to incapacitate somebody, which is better, which comes closer to realizing that goal? Determinate or indeterminate sentencing. Same with general deterrence, retribution, etc. So just sort of think about that in terms of which of the sentencing models comes closest to achieving a sentencing goal. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to take a look at here is factors that affect sentencing. So your textbook talks about that one of the factors that affect sentencing are sentencing guidelines. States and the federal government have published guidelines for if you commit this offense, this is the guidelines in terms of what kind of sentence you would receive. It doesn't say it's the sentence you're going to receive, but to use Derek Chauvin as an example, for his murder conviction, his second-degree murder conviction, that as a first-time offender, the sentencing guidelines in Minnesota say that he could get this guidelines say a minimum of 12 and a half years and a maximum of 40 years. Okay. And that's the guideline, but then the judge can use their discretion. So, it helps sort of systematize and reduce sort of the arbitrariness of sentencing. However, 12 to 40, that's a pretty big range. So there's still a lot of discretion in play. So the sentencing guidelines are standards that define the parameters of the sentencing decision, but they are advisory. They are not mandatory. Now, the judge can also consider factors when sentencing. So you have a sentencing guideline with these parameters, and then what are some of the things that the judge will take into consideration when actually leveling that, imposing the sentence? They'll look at the severity of the offense. They'll look at the prior criminal record. They'll look at the level of violence that was used, the weapons that were used, whether the crime was committed for money, etc. Okay. And so in the Derek Chauvin thing, you're beginning to see in the news media that these are some of the things that the judge will be considering. The sort of the wantonness of the murder, right? That that Derek Chauvin had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, and he was picking pebbles out of the tire, right, of the squad car. Seems a little disconnected, so there's just sort of a wantonness of that. The fact that the crime was committed before minors, right? So there's aggravating factors that will be taken into consideration. Now, keep in mind that your textbook points out that race, gender, and social class are not to be considered when sentencing, right? So you can't give a black guy a longer sentence than a white guy. You can't never give a woman the death penalty but giddy up on giving the death penalty to men, right? You're not allowed to state that, the judge. That's overt racism, and that's prohibited by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. However, as we know, when you look at aggregate data, it suggests that race, class, and gender do play a role in sentencing, right? Because African Americans tend to get longer sentences than white Americans. Men tend to get tougher sentences for the same crime as women, okay? So make sure you read about that in the text. So in conclusion here, the theme or the through line throughout this lecture was thinking about the sentencing of Derek Chauvin and what sentence he should receive. And so if you were the sentencing judge, what sentence would you give Derek Chauvin? What goals are you looking to achieve? Are you trying to send a message to other cops? Are you trying to just, he gets what he deserves? Would you include some sort of a restitution for the family, etc.? And also, would you have an indeterminate or a determinate model in terms of promoting rehabilitation, or to the community and to the victim's sake, just say, nope, he's going to serve X number of years. So, and what are some of the factors that you might take into consideration as well? Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in lecture 2.